Probably no other country in the world has a wider range of ethnic and cultural groups than does the United States. The reason for this extraordinary diversity is immigration. A steady stream of immigrants, notably from the 1830s onward, has enriched and constantly redefined the country's character. By and large, immigrants have come to the United States hoping for greater social, political, and economic opportunities than they had in the places they left. Immigration inspires strong opinions among Americans, both in support and in opposition. It has been a controversial topic in the United States since the first big wave of immigrants arrived in the 1800s. Fears about immigration and its effects have given rise to racial discrimination and even violence. In the 21st century, politicians and the public continue to argue over immigration and its impact on the country's economy, culture, and security. Okay, next let's talk about the first American. The land that is now the United States was originally settled by migrants from Asia. These ancestors of the Native Americans, known as Paleo-Indians, arrived sometime between 30,000 and 10,000 before Christ. They made their way from Asia to Alaska over a land bridge that crossed the Bering Strait in prehistoric times. North and South America were then presumably empty of human habitation. Over thousands of years, the Paleo-Indians and their descendants moved south and east. Eventually, American Indians established settlements throughout the land that would become the United States. Now we move to the early European migration. Migration from Europe to the Americas began after Christopher Columbus landed in what became known as the New World in 1492. His voyage led to the European exploration and colonization of the Americas over the next 3 centuries. Spain, France, England, the Netherlands, and Sweden all set up colonies in what is now the United States. The 17th and 18th century saw the arrival of Germans, Bohemians, Poles, Jews, Dutch, French, Italians, Swiss, Finns, Swedes, Danes, South Slavs, and other nationalities. Many of these Europeans immigrated to the colonies seeking economic opportunity or religious freedom. During the period from 1789 to 1815, migration from Europe was greatly hindered by the wars that grew out of the French Revolution and the activities of Napoleon, Emperor of France. The War of 1812, fought by the United States and Britain, further slowed immigration. Once peace had settled over Europe, however, the greatest mass migration in history began. Next is Great Atlantic Migration. The largest migration in history was the movement of Europeans across the Atlantic Ocean to North America. The first major wave of the so-called Great Atlantic Migration began in the 1840s with mass immigration from Ireland and Germany. A second and larger wave beginning in the 1880s brought migrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Between 1880 and 1910, some 17 million Europeans entered the United States. German farmers, Norwegians, and Swedes migrated to the United States in the early 1830s, with Norwegians and Swedes finding new homes in Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Wisconsin. The Irish famine in the early 1840s led to the arrival of immigrants who settled in New York City and Boston, Massachusetts. The Irish were ambitious, especially for their children, and the parents made sacrifices to keep their children in school and attain power in political offices. The collapse of revolutionary movement in Germany forced thousands to seek safety in America, bringing with them continental customs, music, and cuisine. During the American Civil War, immigration decreased, but an act of 1864 called for the president to appoint a commissioner of immigration to encourage immigration to fill jobs left vacant due to wartime casualties and settle unpopulated areas. States made special efforts to attract settlers, and Western railroads compete with states to incentivize immigrants to take up land. The agricultural distress in Europe during the 1880s led to a surge in European immigrants who arrived in large numbers until World War I. Newcomers differed from earlier immigrants in several ways. Some were men who had left their families in Europe and planned to return when they saved money. Most settled in large cities, finding work in the hardest and lowest paying jobs. Many had little or no education and faced employment and language handicaps. They tended to congregate in communities of their own people, clinging to their old world customs and remained loyal U.S. citizens. Now we talk about immigration restriction. The large migrations from Southern and Eastern Europe alarmed Americans who believed that immigrants had too much political power and that they were taking jobs away from Americans. This fear echoed the reactions to the immigration of Chinese miners and railroad workers decades earlier. This yellow peril had fueled years of anti-Chinese hostility on the West Coast. After the American Civil War, some states passed their own immigration laws. In 1875, the United States Supreme Court declared that the regulation of immigration was the responsibility of the federal government. Congress began to pass immigration laws such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the United States. The first general immigration law was passed in 1882, which required each immigrant to pay a 50-cent tax upon entering the country. New laws placed further restriction on immigration in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Such as the Alien Contract Labor Law of 1886, the literacy tests for immigrants over 16 years old, and the exclusion of anarchists and those advocating for the violent overthrow of government. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 cut immigration from Europe, but the end of the war brought about an exodus from war-stricken countries. In 1920, more than 246,000 people entered the United States from Europe, and in 1921, it was more than 652,000 people. Unemployment was widespread, and the flood of immigrants added to the difficulties. Farmers and labor unions wanted immigration curtailed, while other groups pressed for restriction on cultural grounds. Congress introduced a new immigration policy in 1921, passing a quota law which limited the number of immigrants from each European country to 2% of the number of people of that national origin counted in the U.S. Census of 1890. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 set a precedent for later restrictions against immigration of Asians. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 reorganized previous laws into one comprehensive act, allowing 105 Chinese immigrants each year and making Chinese living in the United States eligible for citizenship. After immigration restriction, here comes the new era. The quota system based on national origins was the foundation of U.S. immigration policy for 4 decades. This changed with passage of Immigration and Nationality Act in 1965. The new law abolished quotas by country in favor of a mainly first-come, first-served policy. The law set an annual limit of 170,000 visas for countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, with a maximum of 20,000 allotted to any one country. A total of 120,000 immigrants were available annually to countries of the Western Hemisphere. Hemisphere is basically any circle drawn around Earth divides it into 2 equal halves, and there are generally considered to be 4 hemispheres: Northern, Southern, Eastern, and Western. All countries in each hemisphere potentially had an equal quantity of immigrant visas available to them. Preference was given to 2 categories of immigrants, however. Family-based preference was given to relatives of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents who hold green cards. Employment-based preference favored professional and skilled individuals. Okay, now let's talk about immigration in the 21st century. The September 11 terrorist attack in 2001 significantly impacted public opinion and government policy on immigration. The Department of Homeland Security was created in 2003, and new laws were passed to strengthen border security and expand the government's authority to screen, track, and deport foreign-born individuals. In 2006, 700 miles of fencing along the Mexican border were constructed. Efforts to pass comprehensive immigration reform failed in the 2000s and 2010s, with some lawmakers favoring strict border security and enforcement, while others wanted to increase legal immigration and provide opportunities for undocumented residents to obtain citizenship. During this period, executive orders were issued by the president without Congress approval. In 2012, President Barack Obama created the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, providing protection for unauthorized immigrants. President Donald Trump used executive orders to implement hardline immigration policies, including the construction of a wall along the border with Mexico and reinstatement of a deportation program. These policies gained approval from conservatives but faced strong opposition. Public protests against raids and deportations demonstrated that immigration continued to be a volatile issue in the United States. Nearly 45.3 million immigrants live in the United States in 2021, the most since census records have been kept. In 2001, immigrants comprised 13.6% of the total U.S. population, a figure that remains short of the record hike of 14.8% in 1890 and slightly below the 13.7% share they comprised in 2019. Okay, now you're probably wondering why people came to America to change their life. Let's talk from the past reasons first. Most of immigrants to America were coming for the most obvious reason, that is opportunity. Industrialization, both in manufacturing and agriculture, meant that there were jobs in America. There was so much work that the companies used labor recruiters who went to Europe to advertise opportunities. Plus, the passage was relatively cheap, provided you were going to make it once in your life, and it was fast, taking only 8 to 12 days on the new steam-powered ships. Okay, next is nowadays reasons to why immigrants come to America. The first one is education. Many of the most successful and influential universities in the world can be found in the U.S., such as Harvard and Stanford University. International students will travel here to further expand their knowledge and training. With such a large number of educational facilities that teach almost anything you can think of, the U.S. often has more available choices for residents of other countries. Okay, the second reason is work options. In addition to all the schools, there are many different career paths available to U.S. citizens that aren't options elsewhere. The drastic variety of cultures and lifestyles throughout the U.S. make it easier to find almost anything you could want to do. Due to the way the U.S. economy is constructed, there are many more money-making and investment opportunities for those with available funds. The next reason is reunification. Many individuals who come to the U.S. do so to reunite their families. These include siblings, spouses, parents, children, or other relatives who moved previously. The fourth reason is freedom. Sometimes it can be hard to remember the many privileges taxpayers have here in the U.S. Freedom of speech and religion are two of the biggest ones that are not necessarily a choice elsewhere in the world. We can say what we want to say and believe what we want to believe without strict consequences from the government. If an immigrant is fleeing from their country because they face persecution for practicing a specific religion, they may choose to come to the U.S. because of its liberties. Okay, the last reason is safety. As well as the freedom to do certain things, the U.S. also has a certain level of protection for its citizens. Not only are you protected by law to say and believe what you choose, but there is also a dedicated justice system to ensure you are treated fairly.